Hello again, everyone, and welcome to our combined faith formation classes, the Agape class and the Young Men's Bible class, two of our larger adult Sunday school classes here at First Presbyterian Church in Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us as we gather together here online for worship and study on this, the second Sunday in Lent, Sunday, March 13th. And today we're observing the beginnings of daylight savings time. I hope that your clock sprung forward 1 hour last night. Our senior pastor, the Reverend Jill Duffield, will be continuing her new Lenten sermon series on finding Jesus in hard places, wrestling with the wilderness questions. And the question she asks today, is God in control? Jill will be preaching at both our 9 o'clock Rejoice service and our 11 o'clock Sanctuary service, and we cordially invite you to worship with us here at First Presbyterian Church, located at 617 North Elm Street, just beside Fisher Park, a few blocks north of downtown Greensboro. If you're unable to be with us in person, we encourage you to worship with us via our live stream of our 11 o'clock Sanctuary service. Just go to our website, www.fpcgreensboro.org. That's www.fpcgreensboro.org. And there you'll find a link to our live stream of the 11 o'clock service, as well as a link to our church bulletin and other church news and information. Our Sunday school teacher, Professor Sandie Gravett, will join us in just a few moments. But first, let's sing a hymn together to warm up our hearts and minds. This Lenten hymn is Beneath the Cross of Jesus. Though appropriately sung during Lent and sometimes during Holy Week, the hymn is really more of a personal reflection on the cross, a meditation on the cross and our own mortality, than it is really a hymn written specifically for a church season. The author, Elizabeth Cecilia Clephane, was born in Scotland in 1830. She was the daughter of a county sheriff, and she lived most of her very brief life around Edinburgh. This poem and several others by her were published in the Scottish Presbyterian magazine, The Family Treasury, some 3 years after her early death, and they were submitted by an anonymous source, most likely family members. In this hymn today, Miss Clephane pictures the cross as a shelter from desolation, and she calls upon a series of metaphors to paint that image. Standing beneath the cross is like standing in the shadow of a mighty rock. It's a home in the wilderness and a resting place from the sweat of labor. Some of this closely resembles a passage found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 32, which goes, "Each will be like a hiding place from the wind, a shelter from the storm, like streams of water in a dry place, like the shade of a great rock in a weary land." Familiar words compared to the text. I'll put the words up on screen for you and invite you to sing along with me, Beneath the Cross of Jesus. Beneath the cross of Jesus, I fain would take my stand, the shadow of a mighty rock within a weary land, a home within the wilderness, a rest upon the way, from the burning of the noontide heat and the burden of the day. Upon that cross of Jesus, mine eye at times can see the very dying form of one who suffered there for me.
and from my smitten heart with tears to wonders I confess, the wonders of his glorious love and my unworthiness. I take across thy shadow for my abiding place. I ask no other sunshine than the sunshine of his face, content to let the world go by, to know no gain or loss. My sinful self, my only shame, my glory, all the cross.
Pain and its role in our lives is not a frequent focus of discussion in the church. I'm not saying that churches fail to talk about issues that are painful, but I am asking you to think about how we approach and do that work. I would contend that when pain is on our agenda, it is mostly with an eye towards triumph over painful circumstances, or, at the minimum, to say that there is hope for something better after enduring a painful experience. God's got this. Look at what God is doing with your life, or God heals all wounds, might be the common refrains. While courage and hope are both important qualities, and I do not want to diminish them as ways to alleviate suffering, too often they are a part of an active effort to avoid pain, or at least to keep pain at a safe remove. That is, we frequently don't want to give pain a place at our table, as if even acknowledging it invites damage. Such fear of pain often means that we repress or avoid it, staying too busy to feel, drowning it in alcohol, indulging in some retail therapy, or trying out some of the bromides the church passes around, as I just mentioned before. God doesn't give you more than you can endure. Jesus will carry your pain. And thus we miss opportunities in all of these things to be present with our own pain as well as with the pain of others. Even if we do not want to wallow, to extend our suffering, we also don't want to skip past the pain without feeling it, without acknowledging that it is real and present and shapes our world. Sometimes, in fact, it seems as if admitting pain is tantamount to saying God is not who we think God is. Thus, this week, I want to shift our minds a bit on the subject of pain and its place, not only in our lives as individuals, but also in the life of the church. I do so to make 3 points drawn from the work of the priest, writer, and teacher Matthew Fox. He encourages us, along with many other spiritual teachers in the Christian tradition, to embrace what is painful, to dive into pain, to be with it, to allow it to be pain, and permit it to speak to us. Why? Why would we want to do that? Because Fox argues that when we embrace pain, we are doing something that can, number 1, help us to understand others, to be open to them. Number 2, we are doing something that can prompt us to redefine what constitutes pleasure in a way that embraces our values more completely. And number 3, pain can help us demonstrate our own capabilities, both individually and collectively. Let us begin with the first of his points. The writer James Baldwin said this: "You think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read, It was Dostoevsky and Dickens who taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive or who ever had been alive. Only if we face these open wounds in ourselves can we understand them in other people. Baldwin is telling us that he felt isolated and alone until he saw his own pain in the characters and circumstances he discovered in books. What a lonely and difficult place to be. It makes me ask if the church is a place where we can discover that our pain and heartbreak and open wounds are natural, normal, a part of the human experience, shared with others. And I would answer, in general, that we have too often answered no, that the church we have come to create in this country is pain avoidant. Of course, churches will say our prayers for the more than 6 million people who have perished from COVID and for all the healthcare workers who have been overwhelmed by having to handle so much death. Naturally, churches will all be talking about the 2 million refugees and countless dead in Ukraine and extending hands to help them where we can. And of course, the church will cry out for people like Katie Meyer, the vibrant young soccer star from Stanford who took her life last week. We will have to come to terms with the fact that suicide is the number 2 cause of death for people aged 15 to 34. But do churches, like the psalmist, weep and groan out loud in public spaces? Do we ask people to vent their anger, their frustration, and to give voice to their agony? Do we hear the pained roars of indictment of everything that God and religion puts forward in the mouths of the Jobs who are in the pews beside us? Do we dare scream our own outrage or cry out in our deepest moments of loss? Do we, like Jesus, pay attention to all the wounded we encounter every day? Do we see who needs to be seen, touch who needs to be touched, listen to the ones that others avoid? We generally, as individuals and as the church, lack that kind of capacity for pain because it is unsettling, uncomfortable, and overwhelming. But I think of the instruction we receive about who we are to be in Philippians chapter 2 and ponder how it helps us to define our task when it comes to pain. Listen to what we are being told. Let the same mind be in you is the opening of this passage. Set your thinking in this way, it says. Well, what specifically are we then supposed to do, and how does that relate to dealing with the experience of pain? Well, this text tells us that at least in part, we have to recognize that there's a choice to be made. We hear that Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. Rather, he took the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. Look at the decision. The choice pits being like what we imagine God to be, immortal, omniscient, all-powerful, against being human and subject to all the limitations and hurts that we humans face. The choice feels like a no-brainer to most of us. Who would not want to embrace escaping mortality? Who wouldn't want to know what's coming? And who would not want to be able to exert power to make changes? What church doesn't want to preach that gospel? But this passage tells us that embrace of God is not our road. Rather, as Christ our exemplar, we are supposed to choose vulnerability. He takes human form, and the vulnerability that he chooses is premised on something that it is all too easy to misunderstand: emptying himself. The verb here is kinoo. It means to void or to place no value on. And that voiding or devaluing or emptying is what he does to himself. The point is this one: when we free ourselves, empty ourselves as individuals or as a church of all the illusions about who we are and what we are to be, when we are emptied of our sense that we have earned a certain level of privilege, or that we should be immune to pain and struggle, only then do we have the possibility of entering into the heart of God, and thus entering into the heart of what love is. Only then do we have enough space in our own hearts to connect with others via our shared pain. And only then can we join together to effect change. I'm going to return to that last point in a minute, but let me go here first. Number 2 in Matthew Fox. When we embrace pain, we are prompted to redefine what constitutes pleasure in a way that embraces our values more completely. What does he mean here? I was talking a few weeks ago to someone who had recently lost her husband. They had not been married all that long, having met late in life. But she said something I found beautiful. We knew going in, she told me, that we would not have a long life together. They embraced the pain of that knowledge. And by doing so, they determined to wring out of every day what love they could manage. They enjoyed walks, even though their legs could not carry them far. They took the opportunity to observe the beauty in the changing seasons or marvel at a sunset, even if their eyes might not see as much of the detail as they once did. They appreciated being able to share stories with one another that kept alive their parents and grandparents long gone, even if every detail might not be perfect, because memory fades. They held hands every chance they had, knowing that one can feel love in many different ways across the stages of life. They ate simple meals and did not get all dressed up for each other, understanding that those things were only window dressing. They laughed at the jokes of their grandchildren or from the pleasure of being in the company of friends, because these things were joyous and to be celebrated. And for her, she took pleasure in what she saw as the privilege of caring for him and easing his transition as death drew near. Yes, she was in pain when he was gone. She grieves. But she also celebrated that they had left nothing unsaid or undone, that they had prioritized love over fear of loss, and that they had embodied that love in the best way that they could. This approach is much like what I think of when I look at this phrase in our Philippians passage. He humbled himself. The verb here is tapenoo, and it's reflexive. That means it is a choice he makes for himself. The connection between choosing humility and acting in such a way as to actualize your values might not immediately seem so clear, but I think about it this way. The Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says of humility. Humility is not low self-regard. Humility means that you are secure enough not to need to be reassured by others. It means that you don't feel you have to prove yourself by showing that you are cleverer, smarter, more gifted, or more successful than others. This means you can see people and value them for what they are. They are not just a series of mirrors at which you look only to see your own reflection. It is the understanding that it's not about you. Now, this orientation does not eliminate pain, but it will ease some of the suffering, because a person who has humility has seated the idea that they are in control and has allowed themselves to be wherever it is that they are, and to make space for others to be the same way. How might we dream of that on a corporate level for the church? A book written last year by the English theologian Martin Percy is called The Humble Church, Becoming the Body of Christ. It does not offer any perfect solutions, but it does suggest that maybe it's time for the church to move, to be where Jesus was, outside, unwalled, among people who are not seeking rules and regulations and doctrines, or talk about esoteric things, or even seeking promises of a great hereafter or certainty about what is coming next. Rather, the church can be present with people who long to be seen with compassion for who they are and where they find themselves, to find respite from the burdens of measuring up to some standard, to engage with the real things they encounter every day, and to be present with them in ways that are not, "Let me solve your problem, poor soul," but "Let us partner together in our mutual brokenness to find ways to be supportive to one another." Which brings me to point number 3. Fox says when we embrace pain, we are doing something that can demonstrate to us our capabilities, both individually and collectively. I want to tell you another story. A work acquaintance of mine, who is about my age, let it drop in recent conversation about her upcoming marriage that she was a widow. It turns out that she married as a very young woman. Within a year of their wedding, and while she was pregnant with their first child, her husband was in a horrible car accident that left him without the use of his lower body. She had to learn how to be married, to support 3 people, to be a caregiver to him, and to be a mother of a newborn, all at the same time. And she managed to do it until he died of complications from his condition about 7 years later. Now, lest you think that this is a story about finding strength in adversity, it is not solely that. She tells me she found strength she was not aware she had, for sure, but she also learned quickly that she could not keep her head above water on her own. She turned to caregivers experienced in helping those without the use of their lower bodies to figure out how to do the tasks that had to be accomplished for her husband and to handle the emotional toll of it all. She turned to people with experience as mothers to learn how to be a mother. She turned to other working mothers to find out hints for balancing work and home. And she not only learned how to communicate directly about what she needed, because she didn't have time to waste on anything indirect, but she also developed an ear to listen to others and to see what they needed. Which brings me back to Philippians 2. This time I want you to look at the line, became obedient. And it's an adjective I want to point out. This adjective is translated from a verb, which means to listen or attend to. And if you have listened or attended, thus you should do. That's how we get to obey. But when we translate listen or attend, it reminds us that we need to pay attention to one another. And it also tells us just how dangerous listening can be. Because when we listen to our lives, when we hear pain, when we listen to one another, when we hear each other's pain, we can find in those points of brokenness connection. We can find those things that help us embrace common values, and we can discover together capabilities, both individual and collective. In short, when we listen, we find the basis of action for realizing God in the world. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said it this way: Christians have forgotten that the ministry of listening has been committed to them by the one who is the great listener and whose work they should share. We should listen with the ears of God that we may speak the word of God. And we should do so even if that listening transgresses the order of the powers that be. To get that point, let me turn to Martin Luther King Jr. He was writing in 1960 about the attacks on him. At this point, he had been jailed 5 times. You'll see his mugshot up there. His home had been bombed twice. Look at the headline, Blast Rocks Resident a Bus Boycott Leader. His life and that of his family was being threatened virtually every day. And in 1958, a woman with mental problems had stabbed him at a book signing with a letter opener. And you can see, if you look at this picture, the letter opener still in his chest. The doctors told him after the 4-hour surgery that if he had sneezed, he might have died. Understandably, all of this suffering, all of this pain for him and for those persons who he loved might have been reason enough to withdraw from the work that he was doing. But he chose a different path. What he wrote was this: As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized there were 2 ways that I could respond to my situation: either to react with bitterness or seek to transform the suffering, that is his pain, into a creative force. He recognized that in embracing the pain, there was a hope to push on to something better. It could be transformative, not by making him a martyr, but by showing a new way. Or was that way new? Because look at what he concludes. There are some who still find the cross a stumbling block. Others consider it foolishness. But I am more convinced than ever that it is the power of God unto social and individual salvation. It is the mind that is in us, making the choice not to embrace a God above it all, but to empty ourselves, take the form of slaves, being humble in our humanness, listening to others, even when that listening connects us and brings us to places that might even mean our death. And so, as we continue our Lenten journey, it is more than worth our time to consider our pain, to think about how we as individuals handle our deepest pains, to consider how we listen, how we attend to the pain of others, to explore how that pain, how that brokenness binds us together, and the path that it can put us on toward being fully human, toward being with God among us. And of course, to ponder how it is like the journey that Christ taught us to take. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to continuing this series with you next week.